All right, per request, here is the lecture on World War II. This one in one take will probably be a decent chunk of time, so you might want to watch it in segments. All right, so before we get into the U.S. involvement in World War II, we should review the U.S. foreign policy prior to that involvement. And if you recall, post-World War I, the Wilsonian vision of the world had been rejected. There is a quote-unquote return to normalcy as ushered in by the presidency of Warren G. Harding and the following Republican presidents. And yet, despite this quote-unquote return to normalcy seemingly be the return of isolationism, there is a myth of isolationism a bit. Yes, again, Wilsonian vision is rejected. The United States does not join the League of Nations. We reject the World Court, but the United States was still playing an active international role during the 1920s. If you recall, the United States brought countries to the table for the Washington Conference. There was the 4-power treaty, the 5-power treaty, the 9-power treaty. There was the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in which countries agreed not to go to war. There was the Dawes Plan that created kind of these circular loans. There was economic expansion into Latin America. And then came the Great Crash and the Great Depression, in which FDR repudiated the Roosevelt corollary, created what is known as like the good neighbor policy. But what you're going to see is that in the mid-1930s, there's a rise of fascism. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, Japan, if you recall, in the early 1930s, attacks Manchuria. The United States responds with the Stimson Doctrine. And so FDR faces both depression and a decaying international structure. And there's then a depression on there's this kind of depression diplomacy that takes place. We get off the gold standard in terms of our internal domestic politics. We let the issue of war debts essentially die. In fact, we forbade banks from making loans to nations, defaulting on their debts. We passed reciprocal trade agreements, which lowered tariffs, getting rid of that Hawley-Smoot tariff on as much as 50%. And what you see, again, is this kind of attempts by the United States to stay out of the conflict that begins in the mid-1930s. And what you're going to find is that the United States, although we have this idea that the United States is a neutral party and suddenly is attacked by Japan and is brought into the war, there is this myth of that 1930s isolationism. And so the United States does pass the Neutrality Act, but those quickly get amended by other neutrality acts. And the reason why is that the conflict in Europe continues to escalate, and the United States realizes that if it wants to stay out of the war, it's going to need to actually kind of engage in foreign policy. And yes, that engagement is less than full involvement in the war, but it's engagement nonetheless. And so the Neutrality Act of 1935 it was an arms embargo against both parties. And yet, 1 year later, this cash and carry policy through the Neutrality Act of 1936 gets put into place. And so, but it is on non-military goods. The countries, they had to transport them on their own ships. Again, they had to pay cash, so that would not result in loans and the cycle of debt and the problems that had occurred through the Dawes Plan. In 1937, Japan attacks Ethiopia. The League of Nations protests, and then Italy resigns from the League of Nations and signs an access treaty along with Germany. And then also in 1937, Japan attacks China. And FDR releases this quarantine speech. Now, the quarantine speech is one of those speeches that, depending upon your view of the degree of isolationism, you might come to some different interpretations. But ultimately, FDR is calling on nations to stop the spread of Japan. And so while it does not necessarily advocate for the relinquishing of territories taken and currently held by Japan, it certainly is advocating for an activist role in, quote unquote, quarantining Japan and keeping them in, their kind of quote unquote corner of the world. Then you get the Lend-Lease Act. The Lend-Lease Act essentially is a huge shift and a change in American foreign policy, in that we are allowing weapons to be sent to the quote-unquote allies in Europe. Now, we're not selling them, we are lending them, we are leasing them. And so he has this speech and basically says, hey, if your neighbor's house is on fire and they come and they ask you for a hose to put it out, you don't negotiate the price of the hose. Like, you just give them the hose, and if the hose comes back, then you're going to be just fine. And if the hose is damaged, then they'll pay for it later. And so he kind of equates this scenario to what's going on right now, that we are lending weapons and ammunition to the Europeans. We're not selling it, that'd be a violation. And if we get it all back, great. Now, of course, we know we're not going to get it all back, and he knows that he's not going to get it all back. And so, but then that Lend-Lease policy translates to even escort duty, where suddenly, the allies cannot necessarily get the weapons there safely. German U-boats are wreaking havoc on the sea, and so suddenly we have American destroyers that are escorting, these weapons that are being lent to the allies. And bear in mind that the United States is not just lending weapons to anyone who wants to be lent weapons. We're lending them specifically to the Allied powers against the Axis powers. Then there's a destroyer for bases deal. We basically give destroyers, so ships, to the Allied powers, and in return, they're going to give us land, bases, and the ability to then, again, put military bases into different countries. Then we put an embargo on the Axis powers. It hurt very strongly, Japan, is one of the reasons why they attack. And then you have the Atlantic Charter, where FDR actually leaves the country. He secretly meets with Churchill, and they draw up a plan of what post-war Europe is going to look like. In the Atlantic Charter itself is even the language of, like, with the ultimate defeat of the Nazis. And so clearly, again, the United States is not a neutral party in this. No, we're not involved in the war, but neither are we just this kind of neutral party sitting in isolation for a war that doesn't affect us. And then at the same time, the United States actually passes the draft. So again, to just be clear, the United States, prior to its involvement in World War II, has a wartime economy. It also has, a draft. And so far be it from this idea that the United States has just kind of sat idly by and then suddenly, we get attacked out of the blue. The United States has clearly shifted away from, this pure isolationism and continually gotten increasingly, involved in favor of the Allied powers against those of the Axis powers. So the New Deal does not effectively solve the problems of the Great Depression, and a big part of that is the Depression was so big and so great, and so it's not necessarily an indictment on Keynesian economics. In fact, what we are going to see in World War II is a war-induced economic recovery. Well, what makes World War II effectively an end of the Great Depression and the New Deal not? Well, essentially, it's federal spending. In fact, the federal budget went from $9 billion a year to $100 billion a year. The manufacturing output of the United States doubled. The agricultural output rose by nearly a fourth. In 1939, the United States had produced less than 6,000 planes. By 1944, it had produced 96,000 planes. In 1939, the United States had produced 237,000 tons of shipping. By 1943, that has moved up to 10 million tons of shipping. And so you have, this war-induced economic recovery, and with it comes kind of this rise and growth of prosperity. It plays a significant role in the development of the West Coast. The West Coast became a launching point for the Navy in the Pacific. Land out west was cheaper and more free to actually develop, and so it's why you still see out west so many military bases that are here, and a lot of that came from the development of out of World War II. In fact, 10% of all money spent during World War II was spent in California, and between 1941 and 1945, the United States spent 4 times more than it had spent its entire history of a country. So the West certainly gets developed as a result of World War II. There's a significant shift in patterns of migration. And then also you have unemployment virtually disappears. Again, unemployment did not go below 15% for the decade of the 1930s. And then suddenly when you take 15 million people out of the civilian workforce, you have a lot of jobs that are suddenly opening up. When you add to it the millions and billions of dollars that the United States government is spending on war contracts, there's all these new jobs of industry. There's all of this expansion of the United States military. And so unemployment virtually disappeared. We suddenly went from having not enough jobs for people to suddenly employers are forced to compete for people, and suddenly like inflation is rising as they have to raise wages in order to attract workers. And so the United States creates the Office of War Mobilization. A lot of these entities you're going to see essentially mirror the ones that we saw in World War I, with just slightly different names. And so, for example, there was the National War Labor Board, which is slightly different than the War Labor Board of World War I. That essentially its purpose was to keep labor from striking. And so it put together this kind of quote unquote little steel formula. It promised a 15% increase in wages, but capped it at 15%. And so people are getting an increase in wages, and yet at the same time, its purpose was to try to stave off this rampant inflation that might have otherwise occurred. Furthermore, it gave the government the power to set food prices, rent prices, wages. Items in short supply could be rationed. It also allowed for maintenance of membership to be put into place, which is the automatic enrollment of members of defense plans into labor unions. And yet still, despite that, there were over 15,000 work stoppages during World War II. And the Smith Colony War Labor Disputes Act basically told unions they had to wait kind of 30 days before they could engage in any sort of work stoppage. And it gave the ability of the federal government to actually intervene and to take over plants should there be a threat to kind of the stoppage of production. And so again, it outlawed strikes in those plants, gave the president the power to seize them. And so what you see is that there's both gains and losses for the labor movement during this time. Rationing during this time became common, and it also changed all sorts of things. Like, for example, because of the need to conserve cloth, clothing changed. So, skirts get shorter and cuffs disappear from men's trousers. Vests surprisingly fell out of style. I know, I was shocked as well. I mean, vests protect us from so many different things. Like a life vest keeps us from drowning. A bulletproof vest keeps us from dying, and sweater vests repel women. So there you go. And again, government spending is going to be the key During 1941, the national debt was less than $49 billion. It increased by that amount every single year for the next 4 years. It was $260 billion by the end of the war. Again, between 1941 and 1945, the United States spent twice as much as it had spent 150 years, and its 150 years of existence. The debt grew 5 times bigger. And more than 40% of that amount was actually met through taxation. So whereas before we had done this through the sale of like bonds, and taxation played a lesser role, taxation plays the largest role in funding the war than it had in any other war. And so, and to do that, the government invented payroll deductions. And so now every 2 weeks, taxes automatically come out of paychecks. Well, that's an invention of World War II. So rather than waiting until April for the government to get money, hoping that people have budgeted with these newer, and higher taxation rates, the government makes it easy. And so they take out money every 2 weeks. And if they take out too much, you can get it back. In when you do your taxes, which is then a really great bonus because it feels like the government is paying you and you forget about the taxes that you have paid. And then bonds do still play a significant role, but less so than they had in World War I. Again, the taxation rate was incredibly high. It was 94% on incomes over $1 million. It was 95% on businesses with $1 million of profit. And the goal of that was to convince people that businesses could not profit inordinately because of the war, because all the government spending, which by the way is taxpayer dollars. And so it's your and I, money that's being spent. And during war, there is certainly a need to be efficient. And so certain things that the government might care about, like fairness and equity, might be sacrificed. And so those high tax rates were set in order to kind of prevent certain people from profiting inordinately at the expense of taxpayers as a whole. The inflation was still a significant problem, which is a significant change from the Great Depression. I mean, during the Great Depression, there was deflation. Now suddenly we're worried about inflation. The prices had risen 25% in the first 2 years of the war. The government tried to combat that with the Anti-Inflation Act. I know, it's a very creative name. In which it allowed the government once again to actually set limits and freezes on prices and wages and salaries through this Office of Price Administration. But that, of course, leads to a black market, rationing of scarce goods. You also are going to see a significant investment of the United States into technology. There's a War Production Board. It never had as much power as the War Industries Board did in World War I. And in fact, small businesses argued that most contracts went to large businesses, but again, efficiency tended to be the primary concern in this kind of age of war. And then the government spent a lot of money on technology. And so with research and development, we spent over $100 million. That was 4 times more than we had spent in the previous 40 years. And in fact, the tale of World War II is one in which the United States essentially outproduces the Axis powers and essentially overcomes these early technological advances that the Japanese and the Germans had over the Allies. In the beginning of the war, kind of the technology of aircrafts and tanks paled in comparison to what the Germans and the Japanese were producing. And yet by the end of the war, that's a very different tale. I mean, the United States had established kind of superiority through the air and sea. A big part of that is through the development of radar and sonar, the ability to detect waves of airplanes, of torpedoes that are being launched, of submarines that are attempting to hide. Bombing technology increased tremendously just through its range and its payload. And then, of course, you have advances through the Enigma machine, which was developed by the British in cracking the code. And the United States actually had kind of this ultra project, and it's kind of one of its first kind of supercomputers known as the Colossus II, which played and so by the end of the war, basically the United States had cracked the Japanese code, the British had cracked the German code, and yet the U.S. code had never been, was not cracked by the Axis powers. The war brings about social change. For never before had the population of the United States been as fluid. You've got millions who are now in uniform, find themselves transported to every section of the country. You've got new defense plants that are being popped up everywhere, particularly in many cases, kind of rural, uncongested areas. I mean, they'd be close to urban centers, but you see certainly a significant increase in the growth of the suburbs. The overall trend was that of south to north and east to west. The population of California grew by 50% during the 1940s. The marriage rate grew steeply as men and women were hastily married, as men were sent off to the draft. And then you have some significant war and social change for kind of specific kind of demographic groups. And so for African Americans, there were many factors that helped improve their status. One is this growing tendency of Blacks themselves to actually demand, fair treatment. A. Philip Randolph and his organization of the March on Washington led to the creation of the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which ultimately led to the desegregation of defense plants. Other circumstances are just simply what World War II was about, and many of the circumstances of it. The reaction of Americans to the Nazi treatment of Jews forced some introspection. I mean, how could we as a country treat Blacks as second-class citizens and then expect them to fight for democracy? And so you see a great migration. We've talked about this great migration over and over again. It's essentially a continuous great migration from post-Reconstruction up through now, of south to north. You see a growth in NAACP membership, particularly as they use this position to kind of enhance and make demands of society, and they had been sorely disappointed after in the wake of World War I, in terms of the benefits that had brought to them given their contribution. Of course, you do see still some increase in racial tensions. We've seen this over and over again. As Blacks tend to either gain or demand rights, there often is a racial backlash. There's still stories in World War II of German prisoners of war getting better treatment. For example, like in theaters, it was common for German prisoners of war be taken to theaters, and you're like, why would they go to the theater? Well, that was actually one of the main sources of news. You need to remember that there is no television at this time, and so the theater was a place to actually disseminate information and news. And so the United States actually used it essentially as propaganda to German prisoners of war to show them the progress of that war in favor of the Allies at the expense of the Axis powers. And so you got, German prisoners of war being given preferential seating to Blacks who are being segregated within those same movie theaters. You see an increase in demands through CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality. They are going to become more radical in their demands. They're going to organize sit-ins and demonstrations in theaters and restaurants. And there will be several important victories that really start to erode segregation in many parts of the country. And now, obviously, kind of the full erosion of that is yet to come, but yet World War II really frayed that in some specific and important areas. And then you also have the contribution of Blacks to the military themselves. They're enlisted for the first time in the Air Force and in the Marines. They are given more responsible positions beyond that of just cooks or janitors. The Army actually commissioned its first Black general. But the kind of shining story of a Black contribution in the World War II has to be through the Tuskegee Airmen. In the same way that we tend to highlight the Massachusetts 54th for their contribution in the Civil War, the Tuskegee Airmen was a program that actually trained over 600 Black pilots. Now, again, when it started, it was this experiment. Many people were opposed. There was actually scientists who would sit in front of Congress and they testified that essentially the Black brain was incapable of understanding difficult concepts like aerodynamics, that at higher altitudes that they absorbed less oxygen, and therefore they would not be able to be successful pilots. And yet the experiment went on nonetheless. And yes, these pilots, they faced mistreatment and racism and prejudice. But finally, through the support of many, including Eleanor Roosevelt, she actually went to this airfield and essentially demanded for them to be sent into Europe. What was happening is they were being trained and then not being sent anywhere. And so they finally sent them over to Europe. Again, initially they just give them missions that essentially don't matter. They were sent into patrolling airspace in Africa once largely the war had kind of left there. But over time, the demand for bomber escort led them into kind of the heart of the European theater. And so the United States was engaging in kind of heavy bombing of Germany. These bombers are big. They are not very maneuverable, and they are essentially sitting ducks for lighter craft that are moving to intercept them. In fact, the average lifespan of a tail gunner once combat actually was initiated was less than 30 seconds. And so there was a huge need for airplanes to escort these bombers, intercept before they were actually taken on and shot at by enemy aircraft, and allowing them to get to their target and to get home safely. And initially, again, a lot of white pilots as bombers didn't want to put their hands or put their life in the hands of Black pilots, and there was resistance. But in the end, it was ordered. There wasn't really anyone else to do it. And what you have is essentially a story of tremendous success. And so that was due to a couple factors. Number one is that Black pilots knew that eyes were on them. And so oftentimes white pilots might look to make a name for themselves. So when, these German airplanes are coming, they would often send a first wave and then peel off and then get those fighters to pursue them. And many of the white bomber or escort pilots were looking to, shoot down as many planes as possible to make a name for themselves. And so they would often then leave the bombers for the second wave to come in and just decimate them. And so, but yet the Tuskegee Airmen, they stayed with their bombers, they kept to their mission. And the other thing is they were just actually better pilots. They'd been trained for so many years. When other pilots had just gotten through a crash course, they had been training for years, and they were some of the best pilots that the Air Force actually had. And so they are the most successful of the bomber escort wings. They received all sorts of, combat medals, medals of honor, and like the Massachusetts 54th, played a significant role in kind of eroding a lot of the, prejudiced preconceptions that people had about Blacks. For Native Americans, there are some significant contributions. As you can see, that photo in the upper right part of your screen is one of the most famous photos of World War II. That's the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest battles that took place, particularly that in the Pacific Theater. It was incredibly important an island for the United States to take in order to launch bombing operations on mainland Japan. And as such, you had, the Japanese were, entrenched into these caves which sat on cliffs. And so when the Marines just landed on these beaches, there was not much cover, and and you have thousands and thousands that lost their lives. And Ira Hayes, who is a Native American, is one of the people that is in that picture. He's actually there, and part of that raising that flag. And yet, the raising the flag in the Iwo Jima is actually a pretty tragic story. If you want to know more about it, maybe with you've got some free time on your hands, you can watch a movie called Flags of Our Fathers, which tells the story of it. And the reason behind the tragedy is that essentially that famous photo is a recreation. Every single one of those people in that photo was then actually taken back to the United States. They were paraded around as heroes. They would, send them to stadiums of people to give speeches to keep morale high and support for the war high, to sell war bonds. And yet all of them essentially realized that knew that they were living a lie. Yes, there is that, and they are in that photo, and that is a photo of the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. But the people who actually originally raised that flag, for the very first time, they all died. And so that famous photo is a recreation of, planting the flag on Iwo Jima after the battle had already been won. And so all these people in that picture essentially kind of suffer all sorts of high rates of alcoholism, depression, suicide, and a lot of it is just simply due to the fact that they were just being paraded around as something that they knew that they were not, having been forced to leave others, their comrades behind in the war effort. Another significant contribution is through the working in factories. Over 24,000 Native Americans actually served within both the armed forces and in the defense plants. But one of the more kind of famous contributions is that of intelligence. And so while the German and Japanese codes had been broken, the United States actually used Navajo code talkers for their relaying of information. Navajo is not a well-known language. It is it's a tonal language, and so you had Navajo who were talking, and not just in Navajo, like they were talking in encoded Navajo. So not only would you need to know Navajo, but you would also then need to actually decode the code that they were that they had come up with. And as a result, the U.S. code was never broken. But again, it's a very dangerous job because you have to be in the heart of these advances in order to kind of relay information for bombardment and tank positions and things like that. For Mexican Americans, a larger percentage of Mexican Americans served in the military than any other group. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there are more Mexican Americans that served in the military than in any other group, but as a percent of their population, more served in the military than any other group. And a big part of that was that the Mexican American population desired to kind of use World War II to make significant gains for themselves and their status in society. You also had the Bracero Agreement, which actually brought in contract workers, many of which, by the way, some of which had been brought in for World War II, only then to be deported during the Great Depression. And now, once again, the need for labor is high. And so the United States is bringing in contract workers in order to fill the need for labor, which was sorely needed during this time. Like we've seen many times, when groups are demanding and gaining rights, there's oftentimes backlashes. One of the more significant examples of this was the Zoot Suit riots in LA. The Zoot Suit is that kind of white, suit. It was a status of fashion, oftentimes by, worn predominantly by Mexican Americans, and so there was the precipitous for the Zoot Suit riots were some sailors who were on leave. They get drunk, and then they decide to attack some Mexican American youths who are wearing these Zoot Suits. They rip off their clothes, they burn them, they beat them, and the police do nothing. When the Mexican Americans retaliate, they're actually arrested. And then Los Angeles decided to solve the problem by prohibiting the wearing of Zoot Suits. For Japanese Americans, they are probably the group to suffer the most egregious treatment of American citizens. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the General DeWitt, who is in charge of the West Coast, actually declared the Japanese race to be an enemy race. And as a result, through executive order by the president, you had the internment of over 100,000 Japanese. Most of them were native-born citizens. They were told to relocate to internment camps. When you had those who were, resisted, in fact, there was a Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States, in which the Supreme Court actually upheld the constitutionality of the internment. In 1944, that was amended. So 1 year later, it was amended ex parte enda. The court forbade the internment of loyal Japanese citizens, but of course, what actually constituted someone who, was loyal? Like, how do you prove your loyalty? One of the ways actually was through military service. And so what you have are, Japanese youth, young men that are volunteering to fight. They would not put them in the Pacific theater, but certainly that in the European theater. And so they are fighting for their country while at the same time their parents are, being interned in camps. Some of the largest internment camps were in both California as well as here in Arizona. War also brought social change for women as well as for children. Women participation in the workforce increased by 60%. In fact, they comprised over a third of the total workforce. But at the same time, one of the reasons that made them attractive to employers was their lower wages. Furthermore, they were not subject to the draft. You also had a lot of these paternal presuppositions about what was appropriate for women's work. So, for example, they would teach women in ways that they would be familiar. So, for example, like you're on a airplane assembly line. You just tell them it's like, hey, it's just kind of like sewing. There's patterns, and rather than just cutting out patterns of cloth, you're just cutting out big patterns of aluminum. Or hey, like baking ammunition, it's just like baking. You follow a recipe, and there you go. But one of the big changes that happened was the growth of government being supported daycare. Many defense plants figured that they lost hundreds of thousands of working hours when women took days off to either care for children or to do things that they're still responsible for. As oftentimes these women are in charge of their families, their husbands are now gone, and none of the responsibilities of their families goes away. And so as they take time off to do cleaning and laundry and caring for children, well, that limits the amount of worker production that can take place. And so suddenly the government is very motivated in order to put programs into place. Now, there was never enough daycare facilities, but overall, I mean, it does kind of hasten the growth of that. And then overall, there's this kind of wartime life and culture, which tended to be comprised of a considerable amount of anxiety. It's an interesting time because it's a prosperous time. People have money, and yet goods are being rationed. And so there's not necessarily a lot of consumer goods in order to buy. Entertainment, therefore, tended to suddenly do well. You see that once again, this kind of return in the growth of entertainment. So the movie industry does incredibly well. Magazines, radio programs. And one of the things you also get is this kind of romanticization of American culture. You know, there's this suddenly, like, as men are off fighting in Europe, they increasingly have a romanticized view of what the United States, you know, was. And suddenly when they come home, their ideas of it don't necessarily match with the reality. Propaganda, of course, is always going to be a part of war. And so part of that anxiety was this idea that spies could be anywhere. German spies are among us. And a lot of this propaganda was actually directed toward women, given, again, stereotypes of women and gossip. And so therefore, they would urge women to be careful about who you talk to and what you say, because your idle conversation might be the very death of your husband. So by the way, when your husband dies, it's your fault. So just want to let you know. And then in terms of the war itself, so there was the strategy of Germany first, and D-Day, of course, is one of those. On June 6, 1944, the storming of Normandy, which actually kind of gives the United States and its allies a kind of a beachhead in France, to which to then make some significant inroads into both France as well as then into Germany. And so they're bombing around the clock. Dresden, Berlin. We firebombed those cities. One of the big things about World War II is that World War II is kind of gets rid of a lot of the lines that had kind of existed. Civilian casualties have always been a part of conflict, and yet in World War II, civilian casualties essentially became the norm, and in fact, and sometimes the targets themselves. So for example, like when you bomb a military target, there will be civilian casualties. But when you firebomb a city, you are just dropping incendiary bombs over the city. You're not dropping them on specific military targets. You are doing that. And this was done by, all involved. So again, the Axis powers they had their V-2 rocket attacks on London. The Allied powers were responding by firebombing cities. And then, of course, in the Pacific, you had the dropping of the atomic bombs, which, again, were dropped on the center of cities, not on specific military targets. In fact, those targets were picked in many ways because they wanted to demonstrate how devastating the bomb was. And so at the time, Japan was devastated. We'd been firebombing Tokyo. Tokyo, by the way, was a wooden city, and so it just burned like crazy. And so again, when the United States, when its victory came in Europe, it pivoted toward the Pacific. The turning point in the Pacific, by the way, is Midway, in which essentially the Japanese fleet is largely decimated. Then the United States engages in island hopping. Rather than try to take every single island on its way to Japan, they strategically take specific islands, and then through embargoes essentially allow those other islands to be starved into submission. And so by the time the United States actually drops the atomic bombs on Japan, the Japanese military is defeated. The question is how close were they to surrender? And um, I will kind of link an interesting documentary about that I will kind of urge you to, to watch. It's certainly very kind of thought-provoking about the United States decision to drop the bomb. But the dropping of those bombs certainly does lead to the end of the war. The question, of course, is always was it necessary, and was the United States justified in doing it? And then with the war over comes kind of a new war going to be brewing. Part of the reason of dropping the U.S. decision to drop the atomic bomb was so they could dictate the end of the war without Soviet help. And so there's a growing distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. But out of the Yalta Conference comes the Charter for the United Nations, a Security Council in which there's permanent members, and any single permanent member of the Security Council can block UN action. It's one of the reasons why the UN has such a hard time doing anything today, because you have permanent members, the United States being one of them, Russia being a permanent member. And so either of them could just block anything unilaterally. And so unless they decide to actually act together and in concert, the UN has a difficult time. It's one of the reasons why you see the United States starts to develop other partnerships outside of the United Nations during this time. You're going to start to see the rise of NATO. Then you have the death of FDR. By the way, the death of FDR actually occurs before the war is over. So it's Truman that takes over. It's Truman that actually has to decide to drop the bombs. And Truman had largely been excluded from a lot of the decision-making process and so Truman in many ways was being manipulated by a lot of people within the FDR administration. And at Potsdam, Truman meets with Churchill and Stalin. They agree to divide Germany into 4 zones, Berlin into 4 zones as well. They agree to try German Nazis as war criminals. But essentially at Potsdam, Truman learns that the atomic bomb works. And so suddenly the concessions that he might need to make in order for Soviet help to end the war, he no longer needs. And so suspicions are going to be mounting, particularly because the Soviets had spies in New Mexico and also knew about a successful test. In fact, the Soviets knew more about the atomic bomb than Truman did, given their spy apparatus. And so the war ends, and yet with that war comes kind of the brewing of the Cold War. There also a reshaping of this kind of the world. And so World War II is one of the more significant events in the 20th century. It still shapes essentially our views on fascism. It has shaped the shifting of the United States and its culture, particularly that of consumption, of Western development, of internal migration. And then you also have the aftermath of World War II, which essentially leads to the Cold War. All right, and so that is World War II in a nutshell. Thanks for watching, and feel free to ask any questions if you have them.